Welcome everybody to this, our sixth lecture in the summer lecture series titled From the Rooftops. These lectures are by the faculty in the Department of Landscape Architecture here in the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. My name is Richard Weller. I am the chair of the department, and today it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Anu Mathur. Anu is a professor in the Landscape Architecture department here in the Weitzman School. She's a landscape architect and an architect. Her work focuses on how water is visualized and how water is engaged in ways that lead to conditions of its excess on the one hand and its scarcity on the other. Now, through this in-depth inquiry into the nature of water and the way in which it shapes terrain, Anu also finds opportunities for new visualizations of terrain and resilience through design. This focus has guided her collaborative research, practice and teaching with her partner Dilip Dakuna. Dilip and Anu have worked all over the world in cultural milieus such as Mumbai, Jerusalem, the Western Ghats of India, the Sundarbans, and more recently the US-Mexico border, and most recently in coastal Virginia. With Dilip Dakuna, Anu is the author of 4 important books. The first, Mississippi Floods, Designing a Shifting Landscape, came in 2001. The second, Deccan Traverses, The Making of Bangalore's Terrain, was published in 2006. And the third, Soak, Mumbai in an Estuary, was published in 2009. The fourth is an edited volume Anu co-edited with Dilip Dakuna, and it is titled Design in the Terrain of Water. This was based on a major symposium held here at Penn a couple of years previous. Now, in 2013 and 14, Anu led a Weitzman School team for the project titled Structures of Coastal Resilience. This was research-based design work focused on the coastal city of Norfolk, and it was supported by the Rocker Foundation. The research question here was, how can we reshape our settlements and our coastlines vis-a-vis sea level rise? The results of this work were recently published in the book Design with Nature Now, published on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Ian McHarg's original Design with Nature. Anu has received many awards across the course of her career, and she and Dilip Dakuna, her partner, are regularly invited to present their work and their ideas in academic and professional forums in the US and internationally. Indeed, as you will momentarily see, Anu's artworks are exquisite investigations of landscape processes. And with that, I will now hand over to Anu. Enjoy today's lecture.
Hi, I'm Anuradha Mathur. I'm a professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the Weitzman School of Design. I would like to share with you today some thoughts about my design process. There are arguably several ways to begin the act of design. I would like to speak of one that has structured much of my partner Dilip and my practice, projects and studios, namely engaging place. I distinguish 2 approaches to engaging place. The first is through the discipline of the line. It gives designers a demarcated site to go to, analyze and interpret, a site with structure, bylaws, history and surroundings. The second approach is through the more spontaneous, seemingly accidental, yet more ordinary and everyday stain. It gives the designer opportunity and possibility. Let us first look at the discipline of the line. There are many kinds of lines. There are lines that gesture, lines that connect, lines that engrave, lines that go for a walk in Paul Place term, lines that shade, lines that sketch. The line I refer to, however, is special. It separates. It separates water and land, private and public, inside and outside, urban and rural, formal and informal. These binaries might break down into shades of grey, but that only multiplies or thickens a line. It now separates water from wetland and marsh from dryland. It introduces the veranda and lobby between inside and outside, the semi-public between private and public, suburbia between city and country, and stages of development between formal and informal. The line, in short, displays what we call a landscape of separation. Engaging place through it is to see things with clarity and certainty, but it is also to seek out things that enjoy clarity and certainty, things demarcated with boundaries, edges, walls, and skin, things disciplined by the classification schemes of the sciences and the social sciences, such as individuals, species, castes, communities and commodities, projections and future scenarios. The stain presents a whole other world. It spreads non-linearly, maneuvering, avoiding, and gathering opportunistically. It does not separate, but rather negotiates its way across the ground. It does not create land and water, but moves as wetness. It does not respect urban and rural, but operates as habitation. It does not know formal and informal, only a field of transactions. As we see it, the stain reveals a landscape of negotiation. Engaging place here is to see things operating like a stain, with opportunity and possibility, maneuvering, avoiding, and gathering. But it is also to seek out things that operate with opportunity and possibility, things that negotiate their way along. So how do we engage place through the everyday stain rather than the disciplined line, seeing and seeking a landscape of negotiation? How do we as designers negotiate our engagement with place? I would like to share with you a few projects we have undertaken in diverse terrains, where we engaged and recorded by means more stain-like than, I would say, line-like. These projects have led to exhibitions and books, and others are design studios. The line tells us that the Mississippi is a river, a flow of water between banks. These banks, which were first articulated by European explorers and settlers in the 17th and 18th century, separate water and the adjoining land and confine it to a course. This course is fed by a multiplicity of tributaries that divide to gather the waters of more than half of the United States and a part of Canada. The two banks meet in several points on high ground, each presumably a source. The outermost of these define the river's watershed. Towards the other end, the course of the river divides into several distributaries to meet the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico at several places. The line does not just define a Mississippi that flows, it also defines a Mississippi that floods. Flood being nothing but water crossing a line that we have drawn. Floods recur each year, and with each flood, the line has been made firmer and stronger, not just with the miles of levees paved with revetments, but an ever more intricate system of watershed management with regulations, floodways, locks, controls, water supply and drainage networks, etc. The Mississippi of the line is then a landscape of flood. The Mississippi of the stain is a different world. It is a world which is of wetness that is everywhere before it is water somewhere. There is much to suggest that Native Americans engaged this Mississippi as a wetness that rose and fell rather than a water that flowed and flooded. They did not separate land from water here, and they did not settle the banks of a river. They rather inhabited wetness on a gradient from low grounds to high grounds that they found or built. It was a negotiated settlement of a negotiable landscape. We engaged this Mississippi through photography, moving by car, by tugboat, as well as aeroplane, but more extensively through drawings and screen prints as well. We engaged it as it meanders its way in the vast and deep soil of the Mississippi Delta between Memphis and Vicksburg. Here the Mississippi has more in common with the Mississippi blues, negotiated between performer and audience, than it does with the scored and staged performances of classical music. The latter shares in an engineered approach to the river, channeling it and cutting off its curves in an effort to drain its waters to the sea. We engage the Mississippi as it networked its way in the Atchafalaya. Maps may single out this network with a mesh of lines operated by control structures that seek to control its flows, but they cannot convey the negotiating power and living wetness of this basin, of bayous, wet mud, and thick air. We engage the Mississippi where the 50-foot-high levees seek to channel its wetness for navigation between the control structures at Simpsonport and New Orleans, and further to the Birdfoot Delta, where the wetness of the Mississippi merges with the sea. Screen prints gave us a way of representing a landscape of negotiation in negotiated ways. Their layers, transparencies, color, construct a thickness that assembles in potentially unforeseen ways and can also be read in multiple ways. The found images, drawings, and other marks come together with a precision that accommodates chance. The line tells us that Mumbai is an island that once comprised 7 islands. These islands grew into one by reclaiming land from the sea and grew more thereafter by pushing back the sea. The British who settled it beginning in the 1660s, when it was given to them by the Portuguese who occupied it since the early 1500s, called it Bombay. To them, it was an island city set apart from the sea with a coastline. The stark divide offered no room for the grey zone of the mangroves, marshes, and backwaters. They were subsequently eradicated until recently, when they were recognized to offer land protection from the sea, besides other benefits. The line articulates a good deal about land, its topography, settlements, properties. It is of little use in representing the sea, which is why maps of the sea are blank. It is an absence that has come to haunt us today as the sea rises. The island language of the line extends to islands within islands as planners and administrators strive to formalize this metropolis of millions into islands of land uses, separating residential from industrial, open space from streets, markets from home. They struggle to create a landscape of separation. Their struggle to create a landscape of separation are compounded by the rains of the monsoons and a rising sea. Both threaten the line with erasure and regularly do so. The stain presents a very different Mumbai, one that does not speak the language of land and sea, formal and informal. It rather presents a Mumbai that is an estuary that negotiates rain and tide by the rhythms of the moon and the monsoon. A Mumbai that is a Maidan that negotiates rituals, celebrations, practices, traffic, markets, recreation, and water holdings through the year. We engage this Mumbai in photo works through places that have defied the delineating eye. Here, these three forts that once marked the edge of land in maps are in fact negotiated landscapes. Beachgoers negotiate their place with fishers and their boats. Cricket players and defecators. Migrants and fishers negotiate a home with administrators, planners, and conservationists. Flamingos, mangroves, and salt pans find a place in the harbor. These photo works identify stakeholders with an interest to further an opportunity. They also articulate a ground of possibility. The line tells us the Wissahickon is a park in Philadelphia, an urban forest that is home to species, both indigenous and invasive. It was once also home to settlers who exploited the falls of the Wissahickon Creek to run their mills and other waterworks. As a park and forest, it is not only set apart from the city, its difference with it is celebrated and intensified. The stain presents a Wissahickon engaged by students through walks of fast sketching, where marks on paper capture landscape, not of separable entities, but of light making its way through canopies to shrubs below, roots engaging the folds of schist, wetness seeping through rocks and thickening the air, pathways realigned by fallen trees. They section not to reinforce an Earth's profile dividing an interior below with an exterior above, but to articulate a critical zone that reaches from the sky to deep in the earth and intensifies around them. They triangulate from point to point, not to articulate an Earth's surface as a surveyor does, but to register multiple layers of occupancy of a forest, the movement of shadows, the maneuvering of water on a hillside, the juxtaposition of differences. These were just few of the ways in which students in my introductory studio in landscape architecture began to see landscape of negotiation rather than separations. The line tells us that the US-Mexico border separates two countries. It is a separation that is made firmer and more secure as we speak, with constructions, surveillance, international policy, and a rhetoric of fear. It is crossed only at entry points and in violations. This landscape of separation, crossings and violations does not stay at the border. It plays out at a distance from the border in homes, families, and economies, tearing them apart. The stain presents a US-Mexico border that is a terrain in itself, one that is more extended than defended, traversed across than reinforced along. Soil here is carried to places far and near on the wind, in storms and in washes through canyons. Birds and monarch butterflies weave fabrics of trajectories. Industrial and artisanal agricultural practices operate in a transactional field of labor, finance, and genetic markets. People's migrations are generated by interaction with climate change, government policy, drug cartels. So how does one intervene in a border that is a negotiated landscape than a dividing line? These engagements set the ground for interventions that are more expansive and inclusive of livelihoods, their uncertainties, and their possibilities. The line articulates the Western Ghats as a range of hills on the west coast of India. Formed out of an escarpment, these hills are home to a monsoon cloud forest, a rich diversity of species, many of them endemic, and peoples who claim indigeneity in forest dwellers, tribals, and Adivasis. Dispersed across these hills and increasing conflict with the forest are rapidly growing cities and mines and quarries that exploit the hills' rich repositories of minerals. The Ghats are also looked upon by cities to the east and west for its catchment of monsoon rains. In 2012, the Western Ghats was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a biodiversity hotspot. The plan is to preserve and protect the forest in reserves, rehabilitate forest dwellers, or develop them out of their dependency on the forest and contain the expansion of urban areas. It is to be a landscape of enclaves ready for opposition in its most fundamental and basic articulation of human and nature, city and forest, development and environment. The stain presents us with another Western Ghats. It is not a world of enclaves, but thoroughfares that are fabricated, woven by migration routes of animals, moisture-laden monsoon winds, layers of basalt, networks of roads, calendars of festivals, practices of cultivation, trajectories of sound, and registration of accumulation and dilution. These Western Ghats become the basis of design interventions that work through thoroughfares by enriching and deflecting migratory routes of tigers, sound-driven trajectories of elephants as they intersect with moving traffic and the passage of people, cultivation and fishing practices. The line and the stain then pull us in different directions. The line calls our attention to a landscape of separable things: water, land, buildings, cities, species. It is the dominant language of landscape. The stain calls attention to a landscape of negotiable practices: walking, gathering, deflecting. Both landscapes emanate from the same place. What matters is how it is engaged. The project that we are currently working on aims to demonstrate the difference through the engagement of several places in India. I will share one of these places, named Varanasi. Lines present Varanasi as a city on the banks of the river Ganges. Histories, literature, environmental sciences, tourism, administration, and plans reinforce this reading. They describe it as among the most ancient of cities and one held sacred by the Hindus, along with the river it is on. Streets here, as in any city, are public thoroughfares and conduits of infrastructure. But as one can expect in India, streets are also places or also sites for animals, vendors, and shrines, and places to host events that operate on several calendars. Walls here are separators of inside and outside. But again, in India, as perhaps in other places, there are also places of expression, posters, advertisements, and expectorate for the chewing of pan. As the face of buildings on the streets, they speak to an aspiration for the pakka as opposed to the kacha, which is the finished as opposed to the raw, concrete and glass as opposed to mud and trash. In short, they aspire to a firm and dry separation. Low grounds in the city is where rain, sewage, and stuff gathers and soil saturates. The plan is to canalize these grounds and drain them via gutters and pipes to the river and to the sea. In the language of the stain, these photographic works tell another story. They speak of a wetness that is everywhere before it is water somewhere, of holding wetness in multiplicity of the small, rather than draining water from big infrastructure. They speak to a Varanasi that is not a city on the Ganges so much as a place in Ganga. Although used interchangeably, the English word Ganges, Ganga, is not a river. It is rather the rain of the monsoon that replenishes the wetness that is already everywhere to begin with, in water, earth, air, flora, and fauna. This wetness does not flow as water does. It rather soaks, seeps, blows, osmotes, and transpires its way to ever-extending holdings of wetness. It is then not enough to say that our design practice begins by engaging place. It needs to be clarified that the place we engaged is a negotiated world that eludes the line of separation. We are then careful with the means by which we record our engagement. They are themselves negotiated practices, such as screen printing, staining, photo walking, fast sketching, triangulating, sectioning, and analog modeling. They provide a platform for design interventions that do not control so much as encourage and direct. Design interventions not seen in future scenarios so much as in present possibilities.